Hello, welcome back. It's the March of the Dead. But first, I'm going to read a couple books. Bone, Part 1 by Tavi Dromio. It seems to me, said Graz, thoughtfully looking into the depths of his flint, that all great ideas come from pure happenstance. Take, for instance, the story I told you last night about my cousin. If he hadn't fallen off that horse, he never would have become one of the Empire's foremost alchemists. It was late one midday night at the King's Ham, and the regulars were always especially inclined toward philosophy. I disagree, replied Iximara, firmly but politely. Great ideas and inventions are most often formed slowly, over time, by diligence and hard work. If you'll recall my tale from last month, the young lady, who I assure you is based on a real person, only recognized her one true love after she had slept with practically everyone in North Point. I put it to you that neither is the case, said Halgard, pouring a topper on his mug of grief. The greatest inventions are created by extraordinary need. Must I remind you of the story I told some time ago about Arslick Own and the invention of bone mold? The problem with your theory is that your example is entirely fictional, sniffed Ixir I don't believe I remember the story of Arslick Own and the invention of bone mold, frowned Garaz. Are you sure you told us? Well, this happened many years ago, when Vardenfall was a beauteous green land with Dummer, where Chimmer and Dwemer and Nord lived together in relative peace when they weren't trying to kill one another. Halgard relaxed in his chair, warming to his theme. When the sun and moons all hung in the sky together, Lord, Mother, and Wizard, grumbled Ixir, if I'm going to be forced to hear your ridiculous story again, pray don't embellish and make it any longer than it has to be. This all happened in Vardenfell quite some time ago, said Halgard, ignoring Ixir's interruption with admirable restraint. During an era of a king you would never have heard of, Arslick Own was one of this king's nobles, and very disagreeable fellow. Because of his allegiance to the crown, the king had felt the need to grant him a castle and land, but he didn't necessarily want him as a neighbor, so the land he granted was far from civilization. Right in the area of Vardenfell, that is. Even today, not quite civilized to this day, Arslick Own built a walled stronghold and settled down with his unhappy slaves to enjoy a quiet, if somewhat grim life. It was not long before his stronghold's integrity was tested. A tribe of cannibalistic Nords had been living in the valley for some time, mostly dining on one another, but occasionally foraging what they liked to call dark meat. The Dummer. Ixir laughed with appreciation. Marvelous. I don't remember that from before. It's funny how you don't hear much about the Nords. Rampant cannibalism nowadays. This was obviously, as I've said, quite some time ago, said Halgard, glaring at part of his audience with civil malevolence, and things were in many ways quite different. These cannibalistic Nords began attacking Arslick Own's slaves in the fields, and slowly grew bolder until they held the very stronghold itself under siege. They were quite a fearsome sight, you can imagine. A horde of wild-eyed men and women with dagger-like teeth filed to tear flesh, wielding massive clubs cloaked only in the skins of their victims. Arslick Own assumed that if he ignored them, they'd go away. Unfortunately, the first thing that the Nords did was to poison the stream that carried water into the walled stronghold. All the livestock and most of the slaves died very quickly before this was discovered. There was no hope of rescue, at least for several months, when the king's emissaries would come reluctantly to visit the disagreeable vassal. The next closest source of water was on the other side of the hill, so Arslicon sent 3 of his slaves with empty jugs to bring some back. They were beaten with clubs and eaten before they were a few feet outside the stronghold gates. The next group he sent through he gave sticks to defend themselves. They made it a few feet farther, but were also overwhelmed, beaten and devoured. It was obvious that better personal defensive was required. Arslicon went to talk to his armorer, one of his few slaves with specific talents and duties. The slaves need armor if they're going to make it to the river and back, he said. Collect every scrap of steel and iron you can find, every hinge, knife, ring, cup, everything that isn't needed to keep the walls sturdy. Smelt it and give me the most and the best armor you can, very, very quickly. The armor, whose name was Gorkith, was used to Arslicon's demands and knew that there could be no compromise on the quality and quantity of the armor or the speed at which he worked. He labored for 30 hours without a break, and recall without any water to slake his thirst as he struggled with the kiln and anvil, until finally he had 6 suits of mixed metal armor. 6 slaves were chosen, clad in the armor and sent with jars to collect river water. At first the mission progressed well. The Nord attacked the armored slaves with their clubs, but they continued their march forward, warding off the blows. Gradually, however, the slaves seemed to be walking uncertainly, dazed by the endless barrage. Eventually, one by one, they fell. The armor was peeled from their bodies, and they were eaten. The slaves couldn't move quickly enough in that heavy armor you made, said Arslicon to Gorkith. I need you to collect all the cadavers of the poisoned livestock, strip their skin, and give me the most and the best leather armor you can very, very quickly. Gorkith did as he was told, though it was a particularly repulsive task given the rancid state of the livestock. Normally it takes quite a time to treat and cure leather, so I understand, but Gorkith worked at it tirelessly. In a half day he had 12 suits of leather armor. 12 slaves were chosen, clad in the armor, and sent with jars to collect the river water. They progressed at first much better than the earlier expedition. 2 fell almost immediately, but the others had some luck, outmaneuvering their assailants while deflecting an occasional blow of the club. Several got to the river. 3 were able to fill up the jars, and 1 fellow very nearly made it back to the stronghold gates. At last he fell and was eaten. The Nords possessed a remarkably healthy appetite. What we need before I completely run out of slaves, said Arslic, owned thoughtfully to Gorkith, is an armor sturdier than leather but lighter than metal. The armor had already considered that and taken stock of the materials available. He had thought about doing something with stone or wood, but there were practical problems with demolishing more of the stronghold. The next most prevalent stuff present in the stronghold was skinned dead bodies, hunks of muscle, fat, blood, and bone. For 6 hours he toiled relentlessly until he produced 18 suits of bone mold, the first ones ever created. Arslicon was somewhat dubious at the sight and smell, but he was very thirsty and willing to sacrifice another 18 slaves if necessary. Might I suggest, Gorkith queried tremulously, having the slaves practice moving about in the armor here in the courtyard before sending them to face the Nords. Arslicon coolly allowed it, and for a few hours the slaves wandered about the stronghold courtyard in their suits of bone mold. They grew used to the give of the joints, the rigidity of the backplate, the weight pushed onto their shoulders and hips. They discovered how to plant their feet slightly askew to keep their balance steady, how to quickly turn, pivoting without falling down, how to break into a run and stop quickly. By the time they were sent out of the castle gates, they were easily very nearly almost amateurs in the use of their medium-weight armor. 17 of them were killed and eaten, but one made it back with a jar of water. It's perfect nonsense, said SKYRIM, but my point is still valid even so. Like all great inventors, even in fiction, the armorer worked diligently to create the bone mold. I think there was a good deal of happenstance as well, frowned Graz, but it was an appealing story. I wish you hadn't told me. If you think that's appalling, grinned Halgard, you should hear what happened next. Let's find out. Part 2. What do you mean the story gets more appalling? Graz was incredulous. How in Boethai's name could it get more appalling? It's a ruse, SKYRIM scoffed, ordering 2 more mugs of grief and a glass of Flynn for Graz. How much worse can a tale get which prominently features cannibalism, abuse of slaves, and the regular placement of rotting animal carcasses? Don't you dare me, growled Halgard, annoyed by his listener's lack of appreciation of his prose styling. Remind me where we were? Arslan is the owner of a stronghold under siege by savage, cannibalistic Nords, said SKYRIM, keeping a straight face. After a lot of deaths and several unsuccessful attempts to get water, he had his armor with the unlikely name of Gorgeth outfit his slaves with the first ever bone mold armor. One of them finally makes it back with some water. It was only 1 jar full of water, said Halgard, pulling back in his chair and continuing the tale. And Arslan drank most of it, passing the remains to his dear armor Gorgeth, and the last dribbles to the few dozen slaves who still live. It was hardly enough to sustain health and well-being. Another expedition was necessary, but they had only 1 suit of bone mold left, as there was only 1 survivor of the trip. One out of 18 slaves made it through the gauntlet of Nords, wearing that marvelous bone mold armor of yours, said Arslan to Gorgeth, and 1 can only carry back enough water for 1. Therefore, mathematically, as we have counting you and me, 56 remaining people at the stronghold, we need armor for 54. Since we already have 1, you only need to make 53 to make the total. That way 3 will make it back with enough water for you and me, and whoever is in the best condition to partake. I don't know what we'll do after that, but if we wait, we won't have enough slaves to fetch even a couple days' worth of water. I understand, whimpered Gorgeth, but how am I going to make the armor? I used all the livestock bones to make the first batch of bone mold. Arslan gave an order which Gorgeth fearfully complied with. In 18 hours. What do you mean, Arslan gave an order which Gorgeth fearfully complied with? Asked SKYRIM. What was the order? All will be clear, smiled Halgard. I have to choose what to reveal and what to conceal. Such is the way of the tale-teller. In 18 hours, Gorgeth had 53 suits of bone mail, said Halgard, continuing, not really minding the interruption. Prepared for the slaves. Without prompting, he ordered the slaves to practice using the armor, and even allowed them more training time than their predecessors. They not only learned how to move and stop quickly in bone mold, but how to adjust their peripheral vision to see a blow before it came, and to sway, to dodge, and where the sturdiest reinforcement points on the arm were the center of the chest and the abdomen, and how to position themselves to take blows there. Against their natural instincts, the slaves even had time for a mock battle before being sent out among the cannibals. The slaves handled themselves admirably. Very few, just 15 slaves, were killed and eaten outright. Only 10 were killed and eaten when they reached the river. That was when things did not go according to Arslan's plans. 21 slaves with jars of water took off for the hills. Only 8 returned to the castle, largely because they were blocked by the cannibal Nords. It was a larger percentage than he had anticipated surviving, but Arslicone felt righteous indignation at the paucity of loyalty. "Are you absolutely certain you wouldn't rather flee?" he hollered from the battlements. Finally, he allowed the survivors in. 3 had been killed waiting for the gate to open. 2 more died almost upon stepping into the courtyard. 1 was delirious, walking around in circles, laughing and dancing before suddenly collapsing. That meant 5 jars of water for 4 people. The 2 surviving slaves, Arslicone and Gorkwith. As the lord of the manor, Arslicone took the extra jar, but he was democratic with the others. "You're quite correct," frowned Graz. "This story is getting more and more appalling." "Just wait," smiled Helgerd. The next morning, Helgerd continued. Arslicone awoke to a perfectly still and quiet stronghold. There was no murmuring in the corridors, no sound of hard labor in the courtyard. He dressed and surveyed the scene. It appeared that the fortress was utterly deserted. Arslicone walked down to the armorer's quarters, but the door was locked. "Open up," said Arslicone patiently. "We need to speak." 30 out of 54 slaves successfully made it to the river and gathered water. Admittedly, some then fled, and a couple didn't survive because I needed to correct their fickleness. But mathematically, that's a 55% survival rate. If you and I and the 2 remaining slaves made the next run to the river, we too should survive. Cillian and Gello left last night with their armor, cried Gorkwith through the door. "Who are Zillan and Gello?" "The 2 remaining slaves. They don't remain anymore." "Well, that's vexing," said Arslicone. "Still, we must continue on, mathematically." "I heard something last night," whimpered Gorkwith in a funny voice. "Like footsteps, only different, and they were moving through the walls. And there were voices too. They sounded strange, like they couldn't move their jaws very well, but I knew one." Arslicone sighed, humoring his poor armor. "And who was it?" "Ponic." "And who is Ponic?" "One of the slaves that died when the Nords poisoned our water. One of the many, many slaves that died, and we made use of. He was always a nice, uncomplaining fellow. That's why I noticed his voice above all the others." Gorkwith began to sob. I understood what he was saying. "Which was what?" asked Arslicone with a sigh. "Give me back my bones." Gorkwith's voice shrieked. There was silence for a moment, and then more hysterical sobbing. "I saw that coming," laughed SKYRIM. "There was nothing more to be done with the armor for the time being," said Helgerd, a trifle annoyed at the regular interruptions. So Arslicone stripped one of the dead slaves of his suit of bull mold and put it on. He practiced in the courtyard, impressing himself with his natural comfortably with medium weight armor. For hours he boxed, feinted, dodged, sprinted, skipped, jumped, and generally cavorted about. When he felt tired, he retired to the shade and took a nap. The sound of the king's trumpet woke him with a start. Night had fallen, and for a moment he thought he had been dreaming. Then the alarum sounded again, far in the distance, but clear. Arslicone leapt to his feet and ran to the ramparts. Several miles away, he could see the emissaries and their vast and well-armed escort approach. They were there early. The cannibal Nords below looked at one another with consternation. Savages they might be, but they knew when a superior force was approaching. Arslicone joyously dashed down the stairs to Gorkwith's chamber. The door was still locked. He beat on it, cajoling, demanding, threatening. Finally he found a key, one of the few scraps of metal that had not been smelted days before. Gorkwith appeared to be sleeping, but as Arslicone approached, he noticed that the armorer's mouth and eyes were wide open, and his arms were folded unnaturally behind his back. On closer inspection, the armorer was obviously dead. What was more, His face and whole body were sunken, like an empty pig's bladder. Something moved through the walls like a footfall, only squishy. Arsagon expertly and gracefully turned to face it, completely imbalanced. At first it seemed like nothing more than a bubble expanding through one of the cracks in the stone. As more of the flesh-colored gelatinous matter emerged, it more clearly resembled part of a face, a flaccid, almost shapeless face with a low brow and a slack, toothless jaw. The rest of the body oozed out of the crack, a soft bag of muscle and blood behind Arslick own, and to the side there was more movement, more slaves welling up through the cracks in the stone. They were all around him, reaching out. "Give us," moaned Ponic, his tongue rolling about his hanging jaw. "Give us back our bones." Arslicon began to rip off his bone mold, throwing it to the floor. 100 figures more pooled into the small chamber. That's not enough. The cannibals had cleared away by the time the king's emissaries arrived at Arslicon's gates. They had not been looking forward to this visit. It was best they, though, philosophically, to begin with the worst of the king's noblemen, so to end their trip well. They sounded the alarm once again, but the gates did not open. There was no sound from Arslicon's stronghold. It took a few hours to gain access to the emissaries. Had not brought a professional acrobat with them for entertainment. It might have taken longer. The place seemed to be abandoned. They searched every room until finally they came to the armorers. There they found the master of the manor, folded neatly, legs behind his head, arms behind his legs, like a fine gown. Not a bone in his body. "The first part of your story was complete nonsense," cried SKYRIM, "but now it doesn't hold true on any level. How could bone mold be made again if the armorer who invented it died before he could tell anyone how he did it?" "I said that this was the first time it was created, not the first time people learned the craft." "And when did someone first teach someone else the craft?" asked Graz. "That, my friends," replied Halgerd with a sinister smile, "is a tale for another night." Holy bones, bones, bones. That's it for that.